In this lesson, we're going to look at file handling in HTML5. HTML5 has two different ways in which the user can select files from the local file system. We're going to look at the first approach, where the user can use the input file control to select files on their hard disk. And then we'll see how you can load them into memory and show them on a web page, both text files and binary files, using the new File API in HTML5. So the first thing to do is to give you a quick look at what the File API looks like. If you go to the w3.org website and go up to File API, then it gives you a list of the new interfaces provided for file handling that we have in HTML5. So I'll just run through these quickly. First of all, there's a file interface that represents a file. It has the name of the file and the date when it was last modified. There's also an interface called blob. This is quite useful. When you read a file, you can split it into slices called blobs, and then you can upload blobs individually to a web server, like slicing a file, so that you can incrementally upload a file instead of loading it all in one go. There's a file list interface, which represents multiple files. So, for example, the user could drag files from Windows Explorer onto a web page, and you get multiple files being dropped onto a control. Or you can have an input control, where the user can select multiple files, and this file list interface would give you a collection of file objects that the user has selected. Once the user has chosen the file, if you want to read it into memory, then you use the file reader interface. And in many ways, this is the key interface for file handling in HTML5. So let me just give you a quick look at that. I'll click on the link to take me further down into the document. So this is the file reader interface. A few key points. It has 4 different methods which allow you to read a file into memory asynchronously. So the first one, read as array buffer. If you have a binary file, this is the method to use. When it's finished loading it, it'll give you the data as a binary array. The second method, read as binary string, is considered deprecated these days, so you shouldn't use that now. If you want to read a text file, then you can use this, read as text. When it's finished reading the file, it'll give you the result as a text file, and you can optionally specify encoding as well. Depending on what type of characters you have in your file, you might need to allow, for example, accented characters in French. I'll show you an example of that in this lesson. The last read method allows you to read data into memory, and the result comes back as something called a data URL. This is like a new schema, like HTTP : and FTP : but instead it's data : followed by the actual data that you've just read in. That's the example we're going to use to read in a binary file and assign it to an image so it gets displayed on the web page. So we'll see that in this lesson. So these are the 4 methods which allow you to read a file. You can also abort reading by calling the abort method, so that will cancel any file reading that's going on at the moment. There are a couple of states here that indicate the status of your read operation. Reads are asynchronous, because obviously you can take quite a lot of time to read in a file. It's an asynchronous operations. All these methods here are asynchronous. In other words, they return immediately, but then they generate events to indicate how far the read has progressed. So there are a whole series of different events here that you can handle as a programmer. This event, I'll just scroll up a little bit further. There you go. On load start gets generated when the load has just started. On load end, obviously, is the last event that gets generated. On load is the one that you'll typically handle, and that's what we're going to handle as well. You also can handle on progress. You can have incremental notifications of how the load is progressing, and you can be notified if it's failed in one way or another, either because of an error or because the user aborted the operation. So that's a quick run through the File API. Have a look for yourself if you want to read the full details on this URL. For the rest of this lesson, I'm going to show you an example. So the example is called filehandling.html. It's in your project file folder, along with a series of text files and binary images. So what I've done, in order to prevent security errors, I copied my filehandling.html onto my web server folder on my machine. I'm using Microsoft IIS as my web server, and the web publishing folder for IIS is the folder called inetpub www.root. So I've copied file handling HTML into there, and then I've run it in Google like so, localhost filehandling.html. So I'll run it first, and then we'll take a look at the code. In order to select the file, I'm making use of the new input file type in HTML5. Another possibility would be drag and drop, to drop files from Windows Explorer onto a control in your web app. But I'm going to use the file control. In this first thing here, I can choose a text file. So I'll choose the National Anthem of France, and it displays it in the text area here. I chose the French anthem because I like it, but also because it has accented characters. I just wanted to show you how to handle accented characters in HTML5 file reading. Okay, so that's a text file. We've also got some other text files. I've got the US anthem, and I've got the Welsh anthem. It's my favourite anthem. My hen wlad fy nhadau yn annwyl I mi, ancient land of my fathers, beloved are you to me. It's quite inspiring, actually. Now, the next one is to load a binary file. So this one allows me to choose a binary file. So I'll select haninkalm.jpg. This is a ski run in Kitzbühel in Austria, and it's incredibly scary. It's the hardest downhill on the circuit. Some of the sections are so steep. There's a section called Mausfahrer, which means the mousetrap, and it's almost vertical. That's from the top. I did try skiing it once, and it was quite embarrassing and quite painful, quite quickly. But anyway, you can see it's loaded the file into memory. That's actually a shadow of me taking the photo in the picture there. So let's see how this works in terms of code. I have the file open in Komodo Edit. So we have a couple of styles at the beginning. I'm going to take you to the bottom of the example to show you what the tags look like. I have a section that deals with the text file. So here we have an input control, and the type is file. So as soon as you select a file on the user interface, then this event occurs to read that text file into memory. And then in the same kind of way, I've got another input control here for file handling, and this one will load in a binary file. So let's take a look at the first function here, on load text file, and see how it works. So this example starts on line 28, goes through to line 51, shows how to handle text files in HTML5. So we get the input control, where the user chose the file. It has a files property, because potentially the user could have selected multiple files. Well, the user didn't in this case, so the length should be non-zero. And the first file in my file collection, so the files property is a collection of file objects. It's a file list. So the first file object, I'm taking the type property to see what type it is, and I'm performing a regular expression here to see if it's a text file. For example, text plain. If it is a text file, then we create a file reader object. And the file reader object, as I was showing at the start of the lesson, has several events. For example, it has an onload event, which means the file has been completely loaded into memory, in which case we take the contents of the file. So the event here represents the file. This is the target. The result, when you read in a text file, will be textual data. So we take the textual data and we assign it to the text area on the screen. The message area LM is this text area here, and it gets assigned the text contents of the file that we've just read in. So that sets up the onload event. We also handle errors. You should always handle errors because lots of things can go wrong, obviously, when you're doing file handling. Okay, so we've created the file reader object. We've installed some event handlers. We haven't actually read the file yet. This is the line where we read the file, read as text, and we give it the file object that the user selected from the file control, and then optionally you can specify an encoding. Now the default encoding is UTF-8, and that wouldn't recognize accented characters. So to recognize that, we use something called ISO 88591. This is also called Latin 1, and it represents Western European character sets, basically. So this will start reading the file asynchronously. When the file has been completely loaded, this event will occur, at which point the event will give us the textual content of the file that we've just read, and then we assign it to the text area as we've seen. So most of the file handling that we need to know, we've just seen in this function. but I'd show you how to deal with binary files as well. Let me show you the second function. This function deals with binary files. It's mostly the same as the first example. We get the binary file that the user selected. So for example, I can choose the start gate. This is the start gate for the men's downhill. Look how steep that is. It's just so scary. So that's the file element where the user's chosen the file. We make sure this time that the user has selected a binary file. If the user chose a file that wasn't an image, then we'd get an error message. So assuming it was an image, we create a file reader object as before. We set up handlers for the onLoad and the onError event. Also, we could have handled the progress event and the abort event as well. And then this time, I read the file as a data URL. So it'll read the binary contents into memory, and it'll represent it as a data URL, data, followed by the contents of the file. When that file's been completely loaded, this event occurs. And at that point, I take the result. Now, the result in this case is going to be binary content, and I assign that into my image there. So that concludes the lesson. We've seen various new file types in HTML5. There's a file interface, there's a blob interface. File reader is the main interface that we use. File reader has various methods, such as reader's text and reader's data URL. And then it has event handlers, which allow you to monitor the progress and to display the file when it's been completely loaded.